Good morning. In response to a post I put up yesterday, which was looking at some data that I found with regard COVID-19, I did an analysis yesterday, producing lots of graphs, looking at the shape of the COVID situation in a number of countries and then comparing it to the UK. And I think a few people, although I gave a brief description of the graphs, gave me the impression that because statistics isn't their thing, it might be quite useful to do a video version of that. So that's what this is. I'm going to go through the analysis that I posted yesterday and explain where I'm coming from. I have to say the analysis, although I did the analysis myself, it was prompted by an idea I saw on a podcast yesterday. So it was partly prompted by that. And that really pointed me, first of all, to a data source, Our World in Data. Our World in Data is a great website. It's got lots and lots of information. And let me actually just share with you one of the examples of that. So let me share with you. So this is a spreadsheet that I got from this one here that I got from that website. And basically, it's a huge long list of COVID cases over time for pretty much every country in the world. So if I stop the chart here, for example, we're on Spain, it's giving me the data from the 31st of December 2019, number of COVID cases, all the way through up until April 19, 2020, and then the next country Sri Lanka, and then we go on, and Sudan, and so on. So it's a huge, great spreadsheet resource. And I thought, here's a great way of getting some data and then using that data to analyze what's going on. And the thing I went for was looking at European data. We've got all the European countries in that list. And I went for a technique which is a standard statistical modeling technique, where if you say you've got data from 12 countries, what you do is take randomly or in a structured way, take, say, half of them, six of those countries, analyze the data from those six and see if there's any commonalities and any sense of connection between those six. And if there is, create like an average model from those six. And then with the other six countries that you didn't put into that model, start doing comparisons to see, well, is there anything we're learning from those countries? We've got this average model we created from six countries. Does it give us any insights into the other six countries that weren't part of that model? And so that's essentially what I've done with the data. And so let me take you through the analysis. Let me share with you. So I've got so many screens open at the moment. I need to get myself in the right place. So let's start. Oh, no, that's not where I wanted to start. So let's stop sharing there and let's try again. I should have tidied up my screens a little bit so I didn't have so many pages open. And what I want is that one there. And I'm going to go right to the beginning of this sequence. Okay, so, and I think I can show this as a, it doesn't matter. I was going to try and show it as a slideshow, but it doesn't matter. This is probably the best format. So these are the six countries that I've chosen. I'm hoping you can see my cursor as I move it around the screen, but I'm just hovering now over the legend for this graph at the bottom. So I've got six countries, all represented by different colors. I've got France, Italy, Germany, Norway, Spain, and Switzerland. They're quite an interesting six countries because they're different scales. Norway has a population, I believe, of around 5 million. It's either 5 million or 10 million. I will get Norway and Sweden the wrong way around. One's 5 million, one's 10 million. I think Norway is the 5 million, but it could be the other way around. And then we've got hugely populated countries such as Germany and Italy. Population density of Norway is pretty small, whereas it's much higher population density again in Germany, Italy, and Spain. We've got cases. We've got a country there, Italy, which is sort of reported to have a very bad experience with COVID-19. We've got a country there, Germany, which has had a much lower reported death rate. So by choosing, and all those countries have slightly different nuanced how they've managed isolation and lockdown and so on. So it was a six-country choice that I thought, well, we've got a mixture of approaches and demographics and all sorts of things in those six countries. So it's a good six-country mix to start with. And what this first graph is, it's the total cases. So the horizontal axis of the graph, although you can't actually probably see the actual data points there, time from February, it's February the 16th up to the other end of the graph is April the 19th, April the 18th. So it's from mid-February to the latest data that we have for April, showing the cumulative number of COVID-19 cases reported in each of those countries. And what you'll see is the country with the most at the moment is the purple country, which is Spain. Then we've got Italy coming down, Germany, then we've got France, then we've got Switzerland, and then we've got Norway. One thing I will say right from the start here, this is tested cases. So different countries have different strategies about how they're working out how many COVID-19 cases there are. As long as a country is consistent within its own data, it doesn't matter for the analysis I'm going to do here now that it might have different approaches compared to other countries. But one thing you've got to bear in mind is that if these are based on test data or testing cases, the data is based on testing cases, it's dependent on how many tests you do. The more tests you do, the more positive cases you're going to find. So although the distribution of peaks here, or the biggest, the right-hand end of the graph, is perhaps as you'd expect. Norway has a very low population, so they would have the lowest cases. These countries like Italy and Spain at the top have quite high populations. It's very much dependent on the level of testing. So, for example, if Norway had chosen to do absolute countrywide testing, it might have produced a red curve much higher on the graph, not because the pandemic is worse in Norway, it's because they've done more testing. So I'm going to make that point right from the start. But this is based on the testing strategies in each of those 6 countries, and then they report how many positive tests they found. So they're your graphs. They're sort of quite interesting for me epidemiologically because the curves have each gone through their steep ascending phase, but then they're beginning to level off. Can you see that the curves are just beginning to level off as we get to the right-hand end of the axis there? And so if you can imagine these curves carrying on, we can sort of envisage there's maybe some plateauing. And of course, these are reported cases. This number won't go down because this isn't reporting within it recovered cases. This is just the cumulative number of positive test cases in those countries. So these are curves that will become, at some point, they will level off at some point, and that's showing that there's therefore no new cases in those countries. And there's just looking by eye at these curves, that appears to be happening, albeit Spain perhaps has got some way to go, Italy is perhaps a bit nearer, and so on. And the purpose of these graphs, this sequence of graphs, is to more properly, more statistically robustly quantify those peaks and what those peaks might look like. So that's graph 1. Let's now move on. So what I've done to convert, let me go back. Graph 1 is the cumulative total number of COVID cases. What I'm doing with graph number 2 is looking at new cases each day. So this is derived from the initial data. This is just how many total number of positive tests in each country to date. If I take 2 data points, subtract 1 from the other, so let's say I take the 4th of April data and take it away from the 3rd of April data, we've got the number of new cases on the 4th reported on the 4th of April. And that's exactly what this graph has done. So this is the new cases being reported again in the same 6 countries over the same time frame. And this now more clearly shows that peaking in these curves has been reached, and we've gone beyond those peaks. So the peaks, so let's look at the Spain graph here, this sort of purple graph. There was their peak. So that was the day, and I can't, again, but around the end of March, beginning April, where Spain reported the greatest number of new cases on that particular day. We started, the Spain curve started with ever increasing, or pretty much ever increasing, numbers of new cases each day. It's gone to its peak, and then as we move away from the peak, the number of new cases each day is diminishing. Now, of course, the number of new cases each day could be diminishing if they were doing less testing. Was actually, of course, the evidence is that countries are actually doing more testing, but on the assumption that testing rates are pretty much the same over the time curve for each country. They don't have to be the same between the countries, but as long as they're pretty much the same in each country, you've got a valid time series. Now, I'm going to caveat that at the end by talking about, for example, in the UK, there's talk about upping the level of testing. So that might actually make the decline of the curve less apparent, because if you're doing more testing, you're picking up more cases laterally. So that will affect the shape. But essentially, from graph number 2, what I'm looking at is number of new cases per day, and each of the countries have peaked. Some countries, it's a clearer peak than others. The blue line, which is France, we've very clearly got a peak again about the same time, the end of March, beginning April, and it was sort of much more sort of consistent rise and a much more consistent fall with maybe a little blip there, sort of the middle of around Easter weekend, a little blip of extra cases there. So that's the graphs looking at new cases per day. Now, what I've done here between graphs 2 and graph 3 is something. So if I look at the blue line, the France line on graph 2, can you see it's very up and down? And of course, again, because this is results of tests, if there's a backlog in reporting tests or there's a backlog in tests on a day, the number might go down, or if there's a sudden clearing of a backlog, the number might go up. So it's very jerky, very sort of up, down, up, down, up, down. So what we do sometimes, we do what we call smoothing. So graph 3 is the smooth version of graph 2. And the way we do smoothing is basically take a 3-day rolling average. So for example, again, I'm hoping you can see my cursor. I'm on the blue line and I've just chosen 3 dots here. If I actually add the new case total or the new case reports on those 3 days, add them up and then divide by 3, I've got an average for the 3 days. And if I keep rolling that average, so if I did the average for the 3 points I'm highlighting here and then plotted it, let's say on the first of the point, then on the next day did the average of that day and the following 2 days and averaged that and put that point, and then moved on a day, the average of that point and the next 2, making 3 in total, averaged that. We've smoothed the curve. So if I slowly scroll, actually probably if I reduce the scale of it, you might be able to see both curves. There we go, both curves alongside each other. So can you see they are the same shapes? I've just smoothed out some of the jerkiness. So if we look at the blue line here where my cursor is on graph 3, I've smoothed out what was quite a bumpy journey on graph 2. I've not changed the data, I've just averaged the data on a 3-day rolling average. So that just takes out some of the day-by-day variability because of things that might be affecting reporting. So graph 3 is my smoothed version of graph 2. So it's the same curves, just smooth. What you'll notice here is that because Norway is a very small population, it is bumbling along the ground of this graph because I've got a scale which goes up to 9,000. The peak cases here in Spain were about 8,500, I think, on the peak day, and in Norway it's in the upper hundreds. So on the same scale, it's going to look very flattened. So if we want to get something meaningful from the shape of the Norway curve and be able to present it along the Spain curve, I've got to do something with the vertical axis of this graph. And this is a process of what we call normalisation. Let me give you an example. So this is away from the real data. This is me playing with some sort of idealistic data. Imagine we're looking at 2 countries, Bonga Bongaland and Trumpland. And let's say the population in Trumpland is 100 million and the population in Bonga Bongaland is 100,000. So very different countries, and we're looking at new case rates for those 2 countries. And let's say the Trumpland curve is this red one and the Bonga Bongaland one is the blue one. So it's a bit like Norway versus Spain in terms of the relative scale. And the number of cases on my vertical axis here is 0 to 1,000. So that's my sort of model data that I want to explain to you how we carry out this process of getting the detail out of the blue curve and still be able to show it on the same graph as the red curve. So if I exemplify that point, if I now say, okay, well, the red curve as we saw before, well, it's just a casting of it on its own separate graph here on the right side. We've got data across the horizontal axis, we've got cases on the vertical axis, 0 to 1,000, and we've got the red curve. That is the red curve that we see on the main graph. But if we now look at the Bonga Bonga data on its own and actually have a different vertical axis, 0 to 100, because it's a much smaller populated country, actually we find that the blue curve, which was squashed and flattened here, is actually a curve very similar in shape to the Trumpland curve. And that's what I want to convey. On the countries on my 6-country chart, are Norway and Switzerland really curves of a similar shape to the countries. It's just the scale of them gets lost on that combined graph. So you notice to get the shape of the curve for Bonga Bonga, I've changed the vertical axis from 0 to 100, and I kept the axis for the Trumpland curve from 0 to 1,000. Now, if I do something clever with the numbers, if I take the Trumpland curve, each data point that makes that curve, if I divide those data, the actual number by 1,000, I transpose that curve on a scale from 0 to 1,000 on a similar curve, but now on a scale from 0 to 1, because I've divided each of the data points by 1,000. If I now do the same thing for Bonga Bongaland, but instead of dividing by 1,000, which was the top point on this axis, I divide by 100, which is the top point on this axis. So if I take each of the data points on my Bonga Bonga curve and divide them by 100, I get the same shaped curve, and again on a scale from 0 to 1 on this vertical axis. And because when I've done that, I put them together, I get this graph on the right. So by normalizing, as we call it, basically scaling the curves of the individual countries according to their peak, I'm putting it on a scale from 0 to 1, I meaningfully get a comparison of the shape of the curves. But remember, if I didn't do that, we've lost the comparison of the shape of the curves because it's lost on the scale of the countries. So this is a technique that allows me to compare countries with different scales of the pandemic, which is probably hugely related to different population scales, or it could be different scales of COVID-19 testing, of course, as well in those countries. What you lose with this technique is that where the curves are on the vertical axis isn't giving us any meaningful information about absolute cases in those countries. This graph, this combined graph on the right, is not saying at any point the number of cases in Bonga Bonga land was the same as in Trump land. We're looking at the shapes of the curves, their relative positions, rather than their absolute positions. So that's what I'm doing with the normalization on the data. So here was my smooth graphs. This was graph 3. This is the one where I'd taken the 3-day averages to smooth it. And what I do, I work out, looking at the data, which day had the peak new cases. So each graph, each color, has a day where there's a peak number of new cases. And like I did with Bonga Bonga land versus Trump land, I scale their curves according to the number of new cases on that peak day for each country. So if the peak cases for Spain, it was about 8,600, I think. I then divide each of the data points that makes up the Spain curve by 8,600. So that curve then gets cast on a vertical axis from 0 to 1. I then do the same thing with all the other 5, and let's look at Norway. Norway, again, I think the peak was about 650 on one day. So all the data points on this red curve, I divide by 650 to get that curve on a scale from 0 to 1, vertical scale from 0 to 1. And that's what I've done on this curve here. So this is the first key transformation I made with the data. And you'll see straight away that the 2 countries that were bumbling along the bottom here, which was Norway and Switzerland, we've now got the beautiful detail of their curves. If you look at the red curve, I'm now going backwards along the curve, but you can see we've got all these lovely ups and downs, the nuances, all on this scale from 0 to 1. Actually, I've done a 1.2 so that the top of the curves doesn't clutter the very top of the graph. But from here, 1 down to 0, we've got this normalization, as we call it, from 0 to 1. All of the curves now are on that same relative scale. It means we can't, well, I'm not saying that number of new cases in these 6 countries ever was the same on any of the days, although all the countries peak on this top line. It's about the relative rather than the absolute use of that vertical axis. So that's the first form of normalization, and it's, as I say, it's expressing the data as a proportion of the peak day. I found the peak day for each country and then divided the data for that country by the peak data or the peak new cases that occurred for that particular country. Now, the second statistical jiggery pokery I did was an interesting one, and again, let me go back to Bonga Bonga land and Trump land, and this is about flattening the curve. Now, there's a huge discussion at the start of lockdown that lockdown is about flattening the curve. Flattening the curve saves lives. So let's say we've got on our normalised vertical scale 0 to 1 Trump land's curve looking like that and Bonga Bonga land's curve looking like that. So Bonga Bonga has flattened the curve, Trump land didn't flatten the curve in this example here. And what you'll notice is the peak of the Trump land curve is much closer to 1 than the peak of the Bonga Bonga land. And the way flattening the curve saves lives in the model that was around in 4 or 5 weeks ago when lockdown was implemented in the UK is that somewhere on this graph there's a horizontal line, which I've not marked, which is the limit of the capacity of the healthcare services to deal with critical cases. And so if we've got this horizontal line, if you can see my cursor moving across, let's say there, all of these cases in the red curve above this line are therefore cases, it's a peak in case load, which cannot be served by the healthcare systems. We've overloaded the healthcare systems. But if that line, again, where my cursor is up here, all of the Bonga Bonga cases are below that line, even the peak of it. So the healthcare system was never overloaded. So the chances are no one died because the healthcare system couldn't deal with them, they would have died if the COVID outcome for that patient was to be that they were going to pass away. So flattening the curve. Now, I know I'm talking about deaths, and my data is actually new cases, but the idea is the same. That flattening the curve is the thing lockdown is all about, because it saves lives. It puts the curve below this horizontal line. So that's what flattening the curve is all about. And one of the things that's interesting is, let me just, same graph, but put some key things on it, is from a statistical point of view, if the curves start at the same time, and that's a big if, I'm going to come to at the same come to in a moment. In other words, if the course of the COVID-19 epidemic in Bonga Bonga land and Trumpland started at the same time, in a non-flattened curve, the peak will be reached much sooner. So you can see the time between start point and the peak of the red curve is a shorter length of time than for Bonga Bonga, the blue curve. It's a longer time to peak. And that's the key thing that we're trying to measure. If I'm going to try and answer the question, has flattening the curve, does it happen, and has it worked? So if we are looking at the data, the curves of my 6 countries that did implement lockdown, is there evidence their curves were flattened? And the evidence for that would be there's a longer time between first start of the pandemic and the time to get to peak. So that's what I'd like to do with the 6 country data that I'm creating in my model, is look, see, are there within those 6 countries, is there evidence that some countries' peaks are earlier or later than others? Now, the problem is I don't know for sure when the cases started in my 6 countries. Now, in this Bonga Bonga Trumpland, I've assumed I do. So here's another way of doing the same analysis. So hang on to your hats. Rather than aligning the curves so the start points are the same, why don't I align the curves so their peak days are the same, and then look at where the curve started? So on my left-hand graph here, which is basically a transcript of that previous graph, there was flattening of the curve because the blue curve started much earlier than the red curve once I've aligned. So the horizontal axis now isn't true date. It's actually going to be sort of just days, but just day 1, day 2, day 3. They have no meaning in terms of whether April or March, because what I've done, I've shifted each curve horizontally on the graph so that the peaks coincide. And then I'm asking the question, did the blue curve start before or the same time or after the red curve? Well, on this example here, the blue curve started before. So if they hadn't flattened the curve in Bonga Bonga land, their peak would be somewhere here where my cursor is. But actually their peak, because of what I've done with the graph, is positioned to be the same as the red curve. So actually they did flatten the curve because there's a longer period of time between the start of their data and the peak compared to the start of the Trumpland data and its peak. Conversely, if Bonga Bonga land hadn't flattened the curve, it's just that their curve was smaller. If I align the 2 curves by their peaks, as I've done here, but we actually look at the graph and see, well, actually both their pandemics started at about the same time, then Bonga Bonga land didn't flatten the curve because there wasn't a longer period of time between the start of their curve and the peak. It's just the peak wasn't as big. So that's what I'm doing with the data. Because I'm uncertain in my 6 countries when the cases start, or it's very difficult from the data because it's small numbers at the start of each country. An alternative way of doing it is align the peaks, move each curve horizontally up or down the graph so the peaks coincide, and then look at when the curves start. And if they start at different times, can we start, okay, well, some countries it's a longer period between start and peak of curve, so maybe they flatten their curve a little bit, and other countries it's a shorter time, so maybe they didn't flatten their curve. So that's what I'm going to do. And that's what this rather messy graph number 5 does. Ignore the solid black line for the moment, but the other countries, what I've done, I've moved them horizontally along the axis, the x-axis of the graph here, so that all their peaks align. And actually I've aligned them, actually it's day 45. Now what that means is 45 days from the very first data point I had for the very first country, we've got the peak of all of them. So that's not, doesn't correspond to a particular day. It's not March the 31st or April the 5th or whatever. It's just 45 days from the time series data for each country. And what you'll notice here is that it does look maybe a little bit like the green curve, which is Italy. Maybe that got going a little bit before. But actually, other than Italy, all the other curves are starting at the same time. So there's no evidence that the length of time from the start of the curve to peak is different in any of the countries. In Italy, it would only be if we started, so let me zoom in here, maybe these countries were starting at day 16, maybe Italy, they started at day 14. So we're not talking many days difference. Maybe their curve's a bit steeper at the start, but actually maybe no more than 2, 3, at a pinch, maybe 4 days difference. Bearing in mind different countries started lockdown and did lockdown in different ways, but started lockdown at different points in their pandemic process. I would expect to see peaks, if lockdown was part of that, to vary according to when they started. But this graph here isn't really showing that. This graph is saying that pretty much, other than that extra couple of days, Italy might have a head start on other countries, relative to their peak day, it took each country about the same number of days to get to peak, irrespective of measures, when those measures were taken in each of those countries. Now, that to me shows that it's the virus that's in control. It's the epidemiology of the virus, not man's intervention, that's making a difference to when the peak of the curve is reached. The black solid line is the average. So basically what I've done here is taken the 6 countries and averaged them. And you'll see the countries follow pretty much. I mean, there's a lot of noise in the data, but actually for something that's real world, real time data, that's a pretty good follow. So if you follow that dark solid black line and then match it to the countries above and below it, you'll see actually there's a fairly consistent pattern through all those countries. There's a few little peaks, like the Germany have a little bit of a peak here, which is away from the others. Italy really has 2 peaks. Can you see? There was a day which was pretty close to the peak that I've chosen to align to a week or 2 before, but I've taken the latter peak for this alignment of the graphs. And Italy is perhaps a little bit slower to come down this side, the right-hand side of the graph, than the other countries, but it's following the same shape. So there's something inherent about the virus which is determining the shape of this graph, rather than our interventions, because they were different interventions in the 6 different countries. So there's my model, my black line, my average curve, having smoothed, normalized and aligned the peaks to take out variations. I've got this model. This is my average of those 6 countries. Now, the interesting thing will be to say, okay, well, let's take another country that's not part of the 6 I've used and see how that fits. And so I deliberately didn't choose the UK to be one of my 6 that went into the model. So that's the first analysis I can do. So on graph 6, my dark solid line is that average curve from the previous graph. And the green dots now, so apologies if you're the same colour that Italy was on the previous graph, so ignore that. This is now the UK data. Look how closely it follows. So again, this is showing that actually there's nothing that we did that's made any difference to any other country. You know, we've got different interpretations of lockdown. We implemented lockdown at different stages. We're a different demographic. So all those differences with the other countries have made very little difference to the shape of our response curve. And that I find absolutely fascinating. Remember, where we are on the vertical axis has been scaled. So I'm not saying that the UK is going to be the same in terms of the peak number of cases and a lot of evidence it's going to be worse. But the shape of the response curve with COVID-19 is fitting the model incredibly well. It does show that if we are fitting the model and continue to fit the model, it's a very good fit on the ascendancy phase here. If we follow it on the descendancy phase, although we're going to have some ups and downs, we're not, we've passed our peak in terms of new cases per day, and this curve is beginning to come down. And then the very interesting comparison with graph number 7 is I've left the UK on, but I've added Sweden. And the reason I've added Sweden is Sweden really has not done lockdown. They've done social distancing in a soft sense. They've got soft measures, but there's very little enforced implementation of lockdown. A lot of businesses are still running. So they're a good European comparison of what difference has lockdown made. Now, remember in my Bonga Bonga land versus Trump land cases, if I aligned the peaks, what I look for is there a difference in start date? So somebody who's flattened the curve will have their curve will have started sooner once they've aligned the peaks than a country that didn't flatten the curve. What's interesting is this goes the other way. Sweden did not implement lockdown. So they should be the one who has the more peaky curve. Trumpland versus Bonga Bonga land. Well, comparing Britain with Sweden, Sweden is the Trumpland, UK is the Bonga Bonga land. So the UK, if it's truly flattened its curve, the green line should have started sooner than the Sweden line. But it's the other way around. The Sweden line started much sooner in relative to when the peak was reached. So this is really, not only is it perhaps showing lockdown has made no difference at flattening the curve, it's changed a little bit the course of the infection. So whether we're going to see, I mean, Sweden, interestingly, they've got a little bit of a surge here just beyond the peak. Assuming it's going to follow the trend, it's going to come down and come downward as the rest of the right-hand average curve does, and I would hope the same with the UK. It's very interesting. Over the next 4 or 5 days where I've got data, I can continue the green line, I can continue the Sweden line and see what happens there. But really, in terms of flattening the curve, Sweden, or rather the UK, by implementing lockdown compared to Sweden, haven't really flattened the curve because the start points here. And I'd sort of say if we scale in here, yeah, I'd sort of say maybe the UK fits the other 6 countries in the sense that it's about 30 to 32 days from start of cases to getting to peak, which was day 44, day 45 here, as opposed to about day 13, day 14 when the Sweden case, when the UK cases started. Sweden probably started 6 or 7 days earlier and had more cases at the start. So maybe they were a little bit slapdash. They were less quick to get people washing hands. Maybe they were less quick for people elderly people to start withdrawing from society. So they got some more early cases. But then actually their curve catches up with ours. You know, it sort of started much more aggressively with cases, and that's what proponents of smoothing the curve would have said, but Sweden didn't lock down, so they're going to get more cases earlier on, which they did, but then actually their curve follows ours quite nicely. So this data analysis, for me, is absolutely fascinating because it certainly doesn't provide any evidence that lockdown flattened the UK curve compared to either the average of all this or the 6 countries I chose to create the black line, and more particularly compared to Sweden that didn't perform lockdown. Maybe it supports that perhaps Sweden are a bit slow to do hand washing measures in those first stages of containing the spread. But actually, beyond that, the curve is pretty much the same. So it's very interesting. I think the virus is in control rather than man's intervention. Okay, so there's my my analysis of the data, the curves that I've got there. The beauty of those curves now, and because it's all spreadsheets, as more data comes in, I can move on the timelines for the UK curve and the Sweden curve and other countries. I can add in other countries, and I don't have to keep it European. I've got all the countries in that spreadsheet. So as time allows, I can start playing about with that. What I can also explore is because it tells me the number of tests carried out in the countries as well, I can have a start looking at evidence. Is there evidence that sometimes if the curves aren't coming down as steeply in one country compared to another, is that because they've ramped up their testing, so they're finding more cases, not because there are more cases in the population, it's just they are testing for more cases, so therefore the numbers might look a little bit inflated. So that's my description. It's very interesting. That's the sort of talk I should have really done with an audience asking questions, because I'm assuming where people's understandings need to be helped in that process rather than people asking me specifically. So those who do look at the video, give me some feedback. Let me know. Let me know if there's sort of holes in my sequence of how I got from A to B to C to D to get to that endpoint. Ask me some questions, and maybe I will do a live Zoom session with a few of you going through that again and just seeing where the questions are in that process. So thank you for watching that, and say, give me some feedback, like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube if you liked that. And I will see you again, no doubt, with some more data very soon. Okay, stay safe. See you soon. Bye-bye.